On the edge of the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, there is a village of broken walls, empty lanes, and houses that have not been lived in for generations. At sunrise, the ruins look almost paused in time. Doorways without doors. Courtyards without footsteps. Rooms open to the wind. The most famous part of the story is simple: Kuldhara was abandoned. But the moment you ask why, the legend splits into two different worlds. One says a curse. The other says pressure, water, and survival. So what actually happened here? A village that vanished overnight, or a place that slowly ran out of options until leaving became the only path left? Kuldhara was once part of a broader settlement network in the Jaisalmer region, home to communities that depended on fragile desert resources. That detail matters because desert history is usually not just a story about sand. It is a story about wells, about rainfall, about routes, about whether a settlement can keep enough water, trade, and stability to remain alive. In a place like this, one bad season is not just uncomfortable. It can change the future of an entire community. That is why the mystery of Kuldhara starts with geography, not ghosts. Before there was a curse in the folklore, there was a harsh environment that had to be managed every single year. The first clue is the layout itself. Kuldhara is not a random scatter of rubble. It still reads like a planned settlement: lanes, house lines, courtyards, and a clear sense that people once lived, worked, and moved through a deliberate urban pattern. That is what makes the site so emotionally powerful. It does not feel like a collapse. It feels like an interruption. You can stand in the ruins and imagine the village at full life. Water pots, kitchen smoke, foot traffic, conversation. Then all of it disappears from the record, and the empty geometry remains. The physical clue is not that the village looks haunted. The physical clue is that it looks organized enough to make absence feel dramatic. In a desert region, settlements do not usually fail for one reason. They fail when several pressures arrive together. Wells weaken. Rain comes late. Routes shift. Trade slows. Travel becomes harder. And the cost of staying begins to outweigh the cost of moving. That does not make the decision less painful. It just makes it more plausible. Kuldhara sits in exactly that kind of landscape, where the line between resilience and exhaustion can be very thin. So when people ask what drove the village out, the honest answer may be that the environment did not need to destroy the settlement in one dramatic blow. It only needed to make everyday life harder until leaving felt unavoidable. Local tradition gives Kuldhara a much darker ending. The most repeated version says the village was forced to leave after an abusive minister tried to claim a local woman, and the residents fled together rather than submit. Another layer of the story says they cursed the land as they left, ensuring no one could settle there again. That is why Kuldhara became a legend. It is not just abandoned. It is morally charged. The story turns the village into a verdict on power, fear, and dignity. And because the curse is so memorable, it often becomes the only thing people remember. But legends are usually built on a real pressure point. The question is whether the curse explains the abandonment, or whether the curse was the story people told after a deeper crisis had already done its work. The more grounded explanation begins where desert communities always begin, with resources. Historical accounts and local studies often point to water stress, drought cycles, and changing settlement conditions in the region. If wells weaken, if routes shift, if trade patterns change, and if nearby support systems begin to fail, a village can become harder and harder to sustain. That kind of decline does not always announce itself with a dramatic final night. Sometimes it looks like pressure building for years. Families move first. Work becomes harder. The village becomes less secure. And then the myth of a single midnight departure makes a complicated transition feel cleaner than it really was. This is where Kuldhara becomes interesting in the way good mysteries always do. The legend is vivid, the history is messy, and the evidence likely lives somewhere between the two. Cursed stories survive because they are emotionally efficient. They compress fear, injustice, and departure into one unforgettable image. Once a place is marked as forbidden, the story protects itself. Few people move back in. Few people try to challenge the tale. And every empty wall seems to prove the legend right. That is the trap. The more silent a ruin becomes, the easier it is for mystery to fill the silence with intention. Kuldhara is especially powerful because it offers exactly the kind of visual evidence folklore loves: a place that looks like it should not be empty. But that visual force does not prove a curse. It proves only that humans hate an unfinished ending. So we invent one. One reason Kuldhara still invites debate is that ruins are dramatic, but they are not a full archive. They show where walls stood. They do not explain every decision made behind them. A village can disappear from occupation long before it disappears from memory. That means the real evidence often lives in settlement patterns, environmental conditions, regional history, and the absence of later rebuilding. Not in one perfect line of text carved into stone. This is where responsible mystery storytelling matters. It is easy to say, the village vanished overnight. It is harder, but more honest, to say that the site likely reflects a mix of social pressure, environmental difficulty, and a legend that later crystallized around the emptiness. The ruins are real. The legend is real. The neatest answer may be the one history rarely gives us. Once a village becomes abandoned, it does something strange in the human imagination. It stops being just a settlement and starts becoming a symbol. Kuldhara is now more than a place on a map. It is a shorthand for injustice, disappearance, desert hardship, and the kind of decision families make when staying is no longer safe. That is why people keep returning to it. Not because the mystery is solved, because the mystery can hold more than one truth at once. A hard environment can push people out. A legend can preserve the emotional truth of that exit, and a haunted reputation can keep the village intact long after life leaves it. So was Kuldhara cursed? The safest answer is that the curse is legend, not proof. But that does not make the story small. It makes it human. The stronger reading is that Kuldhara reflects a real abandonment shaped by environmental strain, social pressure, and regional change, with the curse story acting like a memory device that preserved the emotional meaning of what happened. That version is less supernatural, and somehow more haunting. Because it means the village did not disappear because magic took it. It disappeared because life there became difficult enough that the people chose, or were forced, to leave. That is the kind of mystery Atlas loves most. Not a story that collapses when tested. A story that becomes deeper when you separate what is confirmed from what is believed. Before we leave Kuldhara, there is one more honest question. What evidence would actually change the case? Not a scary story. Not a perfect rumor repeated online. A stronger case would need dated land records, tax documents, water use evidence, or settlement records showing when families stopped living here and why. It would help to compare Kuldhara with nearby polywall settlements instead of treating one abandoned village as if it existed alone. If several villages show the same pressure at roughly the same time, the explanation becomes less supernatural and more historical. If only Kuldhara shows the pattern, then the local story deserves a different kind of attention. That is why the ruins matter, but they are not enough by themselves. The walls show abandonment. The oral tradition preserves meaning. The missing paperwork leaves space for uncertainty. And the best mystery is not the version that refuses evidence. It is the version that tells us exactly what evidence would make the story stronger. If Kuldhara made you think differently about ruins, legend, and loss, stay with the Mystery Atlas TV. The next investigation follows another place where history and storytelling pull in different directions. Subscribe for the full series, and tell me in the comments whether you think Kuldhara was mostly curse, mostly survival, or a little of both.